Jews had murdered a Gentile child for occult rites. The Jews were found guilty and were punished harshly for this deed. They were burnt alive. In the year 1345 in Munich, Germany, Jews reportedly punctured a Gentile child by the name of Henry in more than 60 places, causing the innocent child to be bled dry. In Venice, Italy, in the year 1420, according to local records, Jews ritually murdered a child in a cruel fashion, and they were executed for this inhumane crime. In the year 1462, in the village of Rinn, Innsbruck, in Austria, Jews reportedly ritually murdered a child by the name of Andela on a large stone. The child became a celebrated saint. A church was built around the stone. The city even became known as Judenstein, or the Jew Stone. More recently, in 1997, Professor Robert Brandner of a theological college in Austria said this about ritual murders. He said, "Jews should apologize for their deplorable crimes against Catholic children like the holy martyr child Andela von Rinn, and against adults in the days before Easter, and for the blood of murdered Christians spilt by Jewish hands, which cries to heaven too." Jews became a little perturbed when the Pope met with Professor Brandner. In the year 1475 in Trent, Italy, Jews reportedly ritually murdered a child by the name of Simon. During the process, they also circumcised the child. This has also been the reported case in many other such incidents, although we don't believe it's necessarily a requirement during the bloodletting process. This child too had puncture marks over his entire body. The child was later made a saint.
St. Simon of Trent was murdered in 1475 in Trent, Italy, a beautiful Renaissance city of the era. He was taken off the street by cult members, much as pedophile killers do today. The poor little boy was offered candy and lured away, where he was murdered for the pre-Passover sacrifice to obtain the blood for the rituals. This was a very, very famous case of the era, resulted in the later canonization as a Christian martyr of young Simon. The case is referred to in the book Blood Ritual as a multi-adjudicated case, in that it went before more than one tribunal. The Jewish perpetrators had money and influence, so the case went on appeal, which was a very rare thing in those days. Multi-adjudicated, it went also before the Vatican, where the congregation that decides who becomes a saint examined the case in very, very thorough detail. Simon was canonized, regarded as one of the most popular child saints of Europe, until 1965, when the politically correct ones in the Catholic Church decided to decanonize him.
In the book Lives of the Saints, Father Alban Butler described the child as an infant martyr, and describes the event surrounding his murder thus: "The Jews in the city of Trent decided to vent their hate by slaying a Christian child for the coming Passover, and Tobias, one of their number, was deputed to entrap a victim. He found a bright smiling boy named Simon playing outside his home with no one guarding him. Tobias patted the little fellow's cheek and coaxed him to take his hand. The boy, who was not 2 years old, did so, but he began to call and cry for his mother when he found himself being led from his home. Then Tobias silenced his grief and conducted him securely to his house. At midnight on Holy Thursday, the work of butchery began. They gagged his mouth. They held his arms in the form of a cross, while they pierced his tiny body with awls and bodkins in blasphemous mockery. After an hour's torture, the little martyr lifted his eyes to heaven and gave up his innocent soul. The Jews cast his body into the river, but their crime was discovered and punished, while the holy relics were enshrined in St. Peter's Church. In 1485, another Gentile child reportedly suffered a similar fate at Moristica. Pope Benedict XIV canonized the child, who became known as Saint Lorenzino. and mentioned the child as a martyr in his bull Beatus Andreas. The Episcopal Court of Padua, Italy, attested to the authenticity of this incident. Despite small differences, it is interesting to note that many other religious leaders have acknowledged these facts with respect to Jewish child murders. Cardinal Ganganelli, who later became a pope, once wrote, "I admit as true the fact of the Blessed Simon, a boy 3 years old, killed by the Jews of Trent. I also admit as the truth another fact, which happened in the year 1462 in the village of Rin, in the person of the Blessed Andela, a boy barbarously murdered by Jews." The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther, founder of the Lutheran Church, briefly described his thoughts on this matter in his thesis, The Jews and Their Lies. In history, he says, therefore, they are often accused of poisoning wells, stealing children and mutilating them as in Trent, Weitzensee, etc. Of course they deny this, be it so or not. However, I know completely well the full, ready will is not lacking with them if they could only transform it into deeds in secret or openly. Know this for a certainty and act accordingly. In 1492, LaGuardia, Spain, a child by the name of Christopher was said to have been ritually murdered by Jews. Shortly thereafter, Queen Isabella of Spain issued an edict that banished Jews from Spain forever, and it was not until approximately 1967 the Jews were officially allowed back. There were many reasons cited for the Jews' banishment, such as overall wickedness, but one reason was particularly interesting. It was called a serious and detestable crime. Well-respected historian William Walsh argues in his book, Isabella of Spain, that this crime was that of the ritual murder of Christopher, who later was made a saint.
In 1490, there was a vicious kidnapping and ritual murder of a young Christian boy taken from a small village called LaGuardia, which is near present-day Toledo in Spain. He was taken out into the mountains into a cave and was killed by the ritual murder slaughterers there. It was a very, very, very famous case in Spain, appears even today in various Spanish encyclopedias. The trial was in 1491. All of the conspirators were convicted duly in court. This played a significant role in Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand making the decision, which they weren't quite sure of. But once this case, the publicity from this case caused them to go ahead and make the decision to expel the entire Jewish people from Spain.
In 1502 in Prague, a Jew was found guilty of having murdered a Gentile child in an effort to extract the child's blood. In 1574, Lithuania, in the village of Puna, the Jews reportedly tortured and then murdered a baby for occult rites. In 1598, in Lublin, in Kol, and Kutnia, Poland, it was reported that Jews tortured 3 babies in those 3 cities. When the incident came to court, all Jews who were involved in the matter were discovered guilty. According to the book by the Russian writer Dr. Vladimir Dal, Notes about the Ritual Murders, he says, "It is difficult to determine how many Jewish occult murders reportedly occurred in history." Montague Summers, a well-respected historian, describes some of his findings in his book, The History of Witchcraft and Demonology. Closely connected with these ancient sorceries are those ritual murders of which a learned Premonstratensian canon of Wilthin, Adrian Kemberer, writing in 1745, was able to enumerate no less than 250. The latest of these having taken place in 1650, when at Kadan in Bohemia, Matthias, a lad of 4 years old, was killed by certain rabbis with several wounds. In many cases, the evidence is quite conclusive that the body, and especially the blood of the victim, was used for magical purposes. In 1663, Krakow in Poland, Rabbi Mattatija Kalahora was believed to have murdered a Gentile child for his Jewish occult rites. He was tried, convicted, and executed for the crime. In 1669, near Metz, in France, writes Dr. Dahl, the Jew Levi kidnapped a baby, which was later found dead in the forest. The guilty man was put to death. The details of this case were described in a small French book, Abrège du procès fait aux Juifs de Metz, a summary of the trial against the Jews of Metz in 1670. In 1690, in Belarus, Jews reportedly murdered a young child by the name of Gavril in a ritualistic fashion. In 1997, Belarusian television made a documentary about this child's murder. Only 23 years prior to America declaring its independence from England, Dr. Dahl describes an incident in 1753, Żytomir,